In 1969, something happened that changed the way humanity saw itself forever. For the first time in history, a human being left Earth and stepped onto another world. An estimated 600 million people watched it happen. Families gathered around televisions, streets went quiet, radios stayed on through the night. It wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a moment that felt almost unreal. And maybe that's where the doubt began, because even today, more than 50 years later, millions of people still believe it never happened. They believe the moon landing was staged, that it was filmed somewhere on Earth, that the entire world was fooled. So the real question is not just whether we went to the moon, it's why so many people are convinced we didn't. On July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission reached the moon after traveling nearly 250,000 miles through space. Inside the spacecraft were 3 men who had spent years preparing for this exact moment: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Armstrong and Aldrin would descend to the surface in a small lunar module, while Collins remained in orbit above them. Everything about the mission had been calculated, tested, and rehearsed, but even then, nothing about it was guaranteed. According to NASA's official Apollo 11 mission report, the margin for error was incredibly small. The systems on board the lunar module were operating near their limits. The astronauts were making decisions in real time, often with only seconds to react. As the module approached the surface, computer alarms began to trigger. For a moment, no one was sure if the landing would succeed. Inside Mission Control, engineers and flight directors watched in silence. Every number mattered, every second counted. In his book, A Man on the Moon, Andrew Chaikin describes the tension in that room as almost unbearable. People were afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid that any distraction could somehow affect the outcome. Then, finally, the message came through. The Eagle has landed. At that moment, something shifted, not just for the people in that room, but for the entire world. Hours later, Neil Armstrong descended a ladder attached to the side of the lunar module. A camera transmitted the image back to Earth, grainy, black and white, uncertain but unmistakable. A human figure stepping onto the surface of the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It became one of the most famous lines ever spoken, but almost immediately, questions began to follow. At first, they were small, quiet, almost insignificant. People noticed things that didn't look quite right: the way the flag moved, the absence of stars in the sky, the strange angles of shadows on the surface. Individually, these details seemed minor, but together, they started to form a pattern in the minds of some observers, a pattern that didn't quite make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, people start looking for explanations. In the years following the mission, the United States found itself in a period of deep uncertainty. The Vietnam War had shaken public confidence. Reports of government misinformation had begun to surface. Then came Watergate, a political scandal that revealed deception at the highest levels of power. For many Americans, trust in institutions began to collapse, and once trust is broken, it becomes much easier to question everything else, even something as monumental as the moon landing. In 1976, a man named Bill Kaysing published a book that would change the conversation completely. The book was called We Never Went to the Moon. Kaysing was not a scientist. He had no direct involvement with NASA's engineering or mission planning, but he presented a theory that would resonate with a growing number of people. He claimed that the United States did not have the technology to land on the moon in 1969, that the mission was too complex, too risky, too unlikely to succeed. And because of that, he argued, the government had staged the entire event, filmed it on Earth, and broadcast it as if it were real. At the time, the idea seemed extreme, but it tapped into something deeper, a growing sense that not everything could be taken at face value. The timing of Kaysing's book mattered. It appeared at a moment when people were already questioning authority, already looking for alternative explanations, already wondering what else might not be true. And once the idea was introduced, it began to spread. Slowly at first, then faster. People began to rewatch the footage, not as observers, but as skeptics, looking for inconsistencies, looking for proof that something wasn't right. And the more they looked, the more they believed they were finding. One of the first details to gain attention was the American flag. In the footage, the flag appears to move slightly, to ripple, almost as if it were being pushed by wind. But the moon has no atmosphere, no air, no wind. So how could the flag move? To someone already questioning the mission, it looked like clear evidence. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up. According to NASA engineers, the explanation was simple. The flag had been designed with a horizontal support rod to keep it extended. Without that rod, facade, the flag would have simply hung down, making it difficult to see in photographs. When the astronauts planted the flag into the ground, they had to twist the pole back and forth. That motion transferred into the fabric, and because there is no air resistance on the moon, the movement continued longer than it would on Earth. What looks like wind is actually motion without resistance, but for someone already convinced that something was off, that explanation didn't always feel satisfying, because once doubt begins, it rarely stays small. Another detail began to attract attention: the sky. In every photograph taken on the moon, the sky appears completely black. No stars, no light, just darkness. To many people, this seemed impossible. The moon has no atmosphere. There is nothing to scatter light, so the stars should be visible, clear, bright, everywhere, but they aren't. And for some, that absence became proof that the images had been staged. In reality, the explanation lies in how cameras work. The surface of the moon is extremely bright when illuminated by the sun. The astronauts were standing in direct sunlight. The cameras were set to capture that brightness. According to Andrew Chaikin, the exposure settings used during the mission were not capable of capturing faint objects like stars at the same time as the brightly lit surface. The stars were there, but the cameras couldn't see them. Still, to someone watching from a distance, it didn't feel intuitive. It didn't match what they expected. And when expectations don't match reality, doubt grows. As more people began to question the footage, more details were pulled into focus. Shadows that didn't seem to line up, reflections that looked unusual, movements that felt unnatural. Each one became part of a larger narrative, a narrative that suggested the entire event might have been staged. But here's where things become more complex, because the question is no longer just about evidence, it's about perception. Human beings are not perfectly logical. We don't evaluate every piece of information objectively. We interpret things based on what we already believe, based on what we expect, based on what feels right. And once an idea takes hold, it can begin to shape everything we see. If someone believes the moon landing was real, they see evidence that confirms it. If someone believes it was fake, they see evidence that supports that belief instead. The same footage, the same images, two completely different interpretations. This is where the story begins to shift, because now the question is no longer just about the moon. It's about how we think, how we interpret information, how we decide what is true. Historian Richard Hofstadter once wrote about what he called the paranoid style in American politics. He described how people, especially during times of uncertainty, can begin to construct elaborate explanations for events that feel too large or too complex to accept at face value. These explanations often involve hidden forces, secret plans, powerful groups operating behind the scenes, and once those ideas take root, they can be incredibly difficult to disprove, because they don't rely only on evidence, they rely on belief. The moon landing, in many ways, became the perfect target for this kind of thinking. It was massive, unprecedented, almost unbelievable, and it happened during a time when trust was already fragile. But despite the doubts, the mission itself was not hidden. It was not secret. It was one of the most publicly documented events in history, tracked by multiple countries, observed by independent scientists, broadcast around the world. And yet, the doubts persisted, not because there was no evidence, but because, for some people, the idea of the moon landing felt too extraordinary to be real. And when something feels impossible, it becomes easier to believe that it never happened at all. And once that idea takes hold, that something this extraordinary couldn't possibly be real, everything begins to shift. Because now, people are no longer just watching history. They are questioning it, reinterpreting it, looking at every detail not as proof, but as potential evidence of deception. As the years went on, the moon landing conspiracy didn't disappear. It evolved, it adapted, and it found new life in a rapidly changing world. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, television had become one of the most powerful tools for shaping public perception. Documentaries, talk shows, and late-night specials began to explore controversial ideas, including the possibility that the moon landing had been staged. Some of these programs presented both sides, others leaned heavily into speculation. But what mattered most wasn't the accuracy, it was the exposure. Because once an idea reaches a a wide audience, it becomes part of the conversation. In the decades that followed, the rise of home video, cable television, and eventually the internet would amplify these ideas even further. What once existed as a fringe theory in a small book could now reach millions of people in a matter of hours. And with each retelling, the story became more detailed, more convincing, more difficult to ignore. But beneath all of this, the same core questions remained. If the moon landing was real, why do some of the details look so strange? Why do certain things not behave the way people expect? And why do those explanations sometimes feel unsatisfying? Take the issue of shadows, for example. In several photographs taken on the lunar surface, shadows appear to fall at different angles. To some observers, this suggests the presence of multiple light sources, the kind you would expect in a film studio, not on the surface of the moon, where the sun is the only source of light. At first glance, it's a compelling argument, because on Earth, shadows from a single light source tend to run parallel. So why don't they on the moon? The answer lies in perspective and in the surface itself. The moon is not flat. It is uneven, filled with craters, slopes, and variations in terrain. When light from the sun hits this irregular surface, shadows can appear distorted depending on the angle of the ground and the position of the observer. Objects that are not aligned on the same plane will cast shadows that seem to diverge, even though they are being lit by the same source. Photographers and physicists have demonstrated this effect countless times on Earth. But in the context of the moon landing footage, it doesn't always feel intuitive, and when something doesn't feel right, it creates an opening for doubt. Another frequently cited detail involves reflections in the astronauts' helmets. Some images appear to show unusual shapes or figures reflected in the visor. To conspiracy theorists, these shapes have been interpreted as studio lights, cameras, or even people standing nearby. Evidence, they claim, that the scene was staged. But when these images are examined more closely, a different explanation emerges. The visors worn by astronauts were curved, reflective surfaces. They captured wide-angle reflections of everything around them, including the lunar module, the surface, and the other astronaut. Distortions were inevitable. What might look like a strange figure at first glance often turns out to be a reflection of known objects, stretched and curved by the shape of the visor. According to NASA documentation and analysis by independent researchers, these reflections are consistent with the environment in which they were taken. But again, understanding the explanation requires a certain level of trust, and for those who have already lost that trust, explanations often feel like excuses. Then there is the question of the lunar module itself. Some critics have argued that it appears too fragile, too thin, almost like it couldn't possibly survive the journey to the moon and back. When viewed in photographs, parts of the module look delicate, covered in foil-like material, hardly the kind of structure people imagine when they think of a spacecraft. But the design was intentional. The moon has no atmosphere, no wind, no weather. The module didn't need to be aerodynamic. It didn't need to withstand the same forces as a spacecraft re-entering Earth's atmosphere. It only needed to function in the vacuum of space. According to NASA engineers, every component of the module was optimized for weight and efficiency. Anything unnecessary was removed. What remained was a structure that may have looked fragile, but was precisely engineered for its purpose. Still, to someone seeing it for the first time, it doesn't always inspire confidence, and that gap between expectation and reality becomes fertile ground for skepticism. As more people began to question the moon landing, the theories themselves became more elaborate. It was no longer just about strange shadows or moving flags. It became about motive, about why the United States would fake such an event in the first place. To understand that, you have to go back to the Cold War, a period defined not just by military tension, but by competition. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a race for technological and ideological dominance, and space had become one of the most visible battlegrounds. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It shocked the world. Then, in 1961, they sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit, making him the first human in space. At that moment, it seemed like the Soviets were ahead, far ahead. The United States needed a response, something that would not only catch up, but surpass what had already been done. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced an ambitious goal to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was a bold statement, one that would require enormous resources, coordination, and innovation. Over the next 8 years, the Apollo program became one of the largest engineering efforts in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people contributed to it: scientists, engineers, technicians, companies, contractors, all working toward a single objective. In his book, A Man on the Moon, Andrew Chaikin describes the scale of the operation as almost unimaginable. Entire industries were mobilized, new technologies were developed, systems were tested, failed, redesigned, and tested again. And yet, despite all of that, some people believe it wasn't enough, that the timeline was too short, the challenges too great, the risks too high. From that perspective, the idea of staging the moon landing begins to make a kind of sense, not because there is evidence for it, but because it feels like a simpler explanation. If landing on the moon seems impossible, then faking it might seem more believable. This is where the story becomes less about facts and more about perception, because the human mind often prefers explanations that feel manageable, even if they are less likely. Another factor that contributed to the spread of these ideas was the lack of immediate access to information. In the decades following the moon landing, people didn't have the internet. They couldn't instantly verify claims or access original sources. They relied on television, books, and word of mouth. And if a claim was presented convincingly enough, it could take hold before it was ever challenged. By the time the internet arrived, the foundation had already been laid, and instead of disappearing, the conspiracy theories found a new platform, one where they could grow faster than ever before. Videos, forums, and websites began to circulate, each presenting pieces of evidence, clips taken out of context, images interpreted in misleading ways, arguments that sounded logical but were built on incomplete information. And because these ideas were easy to share, they spread quickly, faster than the explanations that could disprove them. But even as the theories evolved, the core question remained the same. Why do people believe this? Why does the idea persist, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Part of the answer lies in something deeply human, the desire to feel like we understand something others don't, the sense of insight that comes from believing you've uncovered a hidden truth. When someone adopts a conspiracy theory, it often becomes part of their identity, a way of seeing the world. And once that happens, changing that belief is no longer just about presenting facts. It becomes personal, because rejecting the theory would mean admitting that the belief itself was wrong, and that's something people naturally resist. So instead of abandoning the idea, they double down. They look for more evidence, more explanations, more reasons to continue believing. And in that process, the theory becomes stronger, not because it's true, but because it's reinforced. Meanwhile, the actual evidence of the moon landing remains, not just in photographs or video, but in physical objects, scientific data, independent verification. But those pieces of evidence often require effort to understand. They require context, explanation, and sometimes a willingness to accept things that don't immediately feel intuitive. And that's where the divide continues to grow, between those who trust the evidence and those who trust their doubts. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about the moon, it's a story about belief. Because eventually, every doubt reaches a point where it has to face something stronger. Not opinion, not interpretation, but evidence. For years, the idea that the moon landing was fake grew through questions, through uncertainty, through details that didn't seem to make sense at first glance. But when those questions are pushed far enough, they begin to collide with something much harder to ignore: the sheer weight of what actually exists. Because the moon landing wasn't just a moment captured on film, it wasn't just a broadcast watched by millions. It left behind physical proof that still exists today. When the astronauts returned to Earth, they didn't come back empty-handed. They brought with them samples from the moon's surface, rocks, dust, material that had never been seen on Earth before. According to NASA's Lunar Sample Research, these rocks have been studied by scientists all over the world for decades, not just in the United States, but in independent laboratories across multiple countries. The composition of these samples is unique. They show characteristics that are consistent with formation in a low-gravity, airless environment. Microscopic structures shaped by millions of years of exposure to solar radiation. Isotopic signatures that differ from anything naturally found on Earth. In his writings on the Apollo missions, Andrew Chaikin describes how these samples became one of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting the reality of the landings, because they are not just visual, they are measurable, testable, repeatable. For the conspiracy to be true, these rocks would have to be fake, not just convincingly fake, but scientifically indistinguishable from genuine lunar material, and not just for a short time, but under decades of scrutiny from experts around the world. And that's where the theory begins to strain, because faking an image is one thing, faking physics is something something else entirely. But the evidence doesn't stop there. On the surface of the moon, the Apollo missions left behind equipment, devices that were never meant to come back. One of the most important of these is the Lunar Laser Reflector. These reflectors are still there today, placed on the moon by astronauts during the Apollo missions. Their purpose is simple: to reflect laser beams sent from Earth back to their source. Scientists still use them to measure the distance between the Earth and the moon with incredible precision. By timing how long it takes for the laser to travel to the moon and back, they can calculate that distance down to the centimeter. This isn't theoretical. It's not based on belief. It's something that can be done today by independent researchers using modern equipment. If the moon landing had been staged, these reflectors wouldn't exist, or at the very least, they wouldn't function, and yet they do. But perhaps the most difficult piece of evidence to ignore isn't physical, it's human. The Apollo program was not a small operation. It involved more than 400,000 people, engineers, scientists, technicians, contractors, all working across different locations, different companies, different areas of expertise. According to NASA's historical records, the scale of coordination required to make Apollo 11 possible was unlike anything that had ever been attempted before. Each person had a role. Each role depended on others, and together they created something that no single individual could fully control. For the moon landing to have been faked, every one of those people would have had to be part of the deception, or at the very least, unaware that it was happening. And not just at the time, but for decades afterward. No confirmed leaks, no verifiable confessions, no documented evidence from within the program itself. In a world where secrets are rarely kept for long, that level of silence would be extraordinary, almost impossible. And then there's the international factor, because the United States wasn't the only country watching. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was America's greatest rival. They had every reason to monitor the Apollo missions closely, every reason to look for flaws, to find inconsistencies, to expose any sign of deception. According to historical accounts, Soviet tracking stations followed the Apollo 11 mission as it traveled to the moon. They had the capability to detect whether the spacecraft was actually making the journey, and if it wasn't, they would have known. But they didn't challenge it, they didn't dispute it, they acknowledged it. In the context of the Cold War, that acknowledgement carries weight, because if there had been any evidence of fraud, it would have been one of the most powerful propaganda victories imaginable, and yet it never happened. Still, despite all of this, the doubt remains, because evidence alone is not always enough. For some people, the existence of proof does not erase the feeling that something isn't right, that something still doesn't add up. And this is where the story reaches its most important point, because now the question is no longer about what happened, it's about why the doubt survives, why, even in the presence of overwhelming evidence, belief in the conspiracy continues. Part of the answer lies in how information is processed, not just what we see, but how we interpret it. When people encounter evidence that contradicts what they already believe, they don't always change their minds. Sometimes they do the opposite. They look for ways to explain the evidence away, to reinterpret it, to fit it into their existing view of the world. Psychologists refer to this as confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that supports our beliefs while dismissing information that challenges them. In the context of the moon landing, this means that every piece of evidence can be seen in two ways: as proof or as part of the cover-up. If someone believes the landing was real, the moon rocks are evidence. If someone believes it was fake, the rocks become part of the story. Something planted, something fabricated, and once that mindset takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to break, because every attempt to prove the truth is seen not as clarification, but as further deception. This creates a closed system, a belief that reinforces itself, and in that system, doubt is not a weakness. It becomes a strength, a sign that someone is thinking differently, questioning what others accept. That feeling can be powerful, because it creates a sense of control, a sense of understanding, even if that understanding isn't accurate. Meanwhile, the actual story of the moon landing remains what it has always been: a complex, risky, and extraordinary achievement, one that required precision, courage, and innovation on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. But that story competes with something else, something simpler, something easier to grasp: the idea that it was all an illusion. And when given the choice between a complicated reality and a simple explanation, many people gravitate toward the one that feels more manageable, not because it's true, but because it feels easier to believe. And in the end, that's what this story really comes down to. Not just what happened happened in 1969, but how people choose to understand it, because the moon landing sits at a strange intersection between reality and perception, between proof and belief, between what we know and what we feel. For more than half a century, the evidence has remained the same. The recordings, the photographs, the mission data, the lunar samples, the equipment still sitting on the moon, the independent tracking from other nations, the thousands of people who made it possible. None of that has changed. What has changed is how people respond to it. In a world where information moves faster than ever, where anyone can publish an idea and reach millions, the line between fact and interpretation has become harder to see, not because the facts are hidden, but because they are surrounded by opinions, by speculation, by voices that sound convincing, even when they're not correct. And when those voices repeat the same ideas often enough, they begin to feel familiar. And when something feels familiar, it starts to feel true. This is how doubt survives, not by overpowering evidence, but by outlasting attention. Because most people don't spend hours reading technical reports. They don't study the engineering behind spacecraft. They don't analyze the physics of light and shadow. They rely on what they see, what they hear, what makes sense in the moment. And sometimes what makes sense isn't always what's real. In his book, A Man on the Moon, Andrew Chaikin describes the Apollo missions not just as technical achievements, but as deeply human stories. Stories of risk, of uncertainty, of people making decisions under pressure, knowing that failure could mean death. That part of the story is often overlooked because it doesn't fit easily into a simple narrative. It's complicated, messy, real, and maybe that's part of the reason why the conspiracy theory persists, because the real story requires effort to understand. It requires accepting that something incredibly difficult was actually accomplished, that human beings, with all their limitations, managed to solve a problem that had never been solved before. For some, that's inspiring. For others, it feels unlikely. And when something feels unlikely, it opens the door to another possibility, even if that possibility has no solid foundation. But the truth is, the moon landing was not a perfect moment. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't guaranteed. There were alarms during the descent. Fuel was running low. The landing site had to be adjusted in real time. According to NASA's mission records, Neil Armstrong had to manually guide the lunar module to a safer location, avoiding a field of rocks that could have destroyed the spacecraft. By the time they touched down, they had only seconds of fuel remaining. That's not the kind of detail you would expect in a staged event. It's unpredictable, risky, uncontrolled. It's real, and that reality is reflected in every part of the mission, not just in the success, but in the uncertainty that surrounded it. The moon landing wasn't a performance. It was a test, a challenge, one that could have ended very differently, and yet it didn't. Human beings left Earth, traveled across space, and stood on another world. That is not an easy story to accept, because it changes something fundamental. It expands what we believe is possible, and when something expands our understanding that much, it can be uncomfortable. It's easier, in some ways, to believe that it didn't happen, that it was controlled, planned, fabricated, because that version of the story keeps the world within familiar limits. But the real story doesn't do that. The real story says that those limits can be broken, that the impossible can become real. That, under the right conditions, human beings are capable of far more than they expect. And that idea is powerful, but it's also demanding, because if it's true, then it changes how we see everything else. It raises new questions, not about what's fake, but about what else might be possible. And maybe that's the part that matters most, because in the end, the moon landing is not just about the past. It's about perspective. It's about how we decide what is real, what we trust, what we question, and more importantly, why. Because the same instincts that lead people to question the moon landing are the same instincts that shape how we understand the world today. The difference is not in the information, it's in how we interpret it. Some people look at the moon landing and see proof of human achievement. Others look at the same event and see a reason to doubt. The facts remain unchanged, but the meaning shifts, and that's what makes this story so enduring. Not the conspiracy itself, but the way it reveals something deeper, something about human nature, the need to make sense of things, to find patterns, to question what we're told. Those instincts are not wrong. They're part of how we learn, how we grow, but they can also lead us in the wrong direction, especially when questions are asked without seeking real answers. Because questioning something is only valuable if it leads closer to the truth, not further away from it. And in the case of the moon landing, the truth has been there all along, not hidden, not buried, but available in the data, in the evidence, in the history that has been studied, tested, and confirmed over decades. The challenge is not finding the truth, it's choosing to accept it. And maybe that's the real reason this question still exists. Not because we don't have the answers, but because belief doesn't always follow evidence. And that's something that goes far beyond the moon. Because long after the footprints on the lunar surface have faded from memory, the way we decide what to believe will still be here, shaping every story, every moment, every version of reality we choose to accept. And that might be the most important part of this story. Not whether we went to the moon, but what it reveals about us that some people still believe we didn't. If you find yourself thinking differently after hearing this, that's where these stories begin to matter. Not in what they tell you, but in what they make you question.